Across the relentless gray of the North Sea, an impossible violin melody drifted. It found Thomas, alone on the night watch, pulling him to the rail. The music swelled, a haunting, liquid beauty that promised oblivion. Then, silence. When the first bruised light of dawn finally broke, Thomas had vanished. The Valkyrie, a sturdy Norwegian fishing trawler, was far from the fjords it called home, deep in the churning expanse of the North Sea. Its steel hull, scarred by years of relentless waves, usually hummed with the predictable rhythm of hard work and the shared camaraderie of its seasoned crew. But a new, unsettling rhythm had begun to pulse through its timbers, born from the bow of a single violin. He was Elias, a man who had appeared from the mist-shrouded docks of a forgotten port, a last-minute replacement for a crewman lost to a shore leave accident. Elias was quiet, almost unnervingly so, his eyes dark pools that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. His only constant companion was a well-worn violin case, cradled with a reverence the crew soon understood. At first, his nightly performances were a welcome novelty. After long, brutal shifts, Elias would emerge, a silent silhouette against the dim cabin light, and raise his instrument. The melodies that poured forth were unlike anything they had ever heard. They were ancient, mournful, yet impossibly beautiful, weaving tales of distant shores, lost loves, and the cold, unfathomable depths beneath the keel. The crew, hardened men of the sea, would gather, mesmerized, their pipes forgotten, their weary faces softened by the haunting strains. They called him the Fiddler of the North, a strange, unlooked-for blessing on their isolated voyage. But the blessing soon twisted into something else entirely. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a slow leak in the hull. First, small, inexplicable misfortunes. A vital winch seized, its gears inexplicably stripped, delaying a crucial haul despite clear waters. Then, the fishing nets, strong as steel, would return to deck shredded, not by rocks or propellers, but as if torn by unseen hands. The damage, too precise, too deliberate for natural wear. The ship's compass, a reliable old friend, began to spin wildly, pointing north one moment, west the next, sending Captain Erickson into a quiet, simmering rage. Seasoned sailors, men who had navigated these treacherous waters for decades, found themselves questioning their own sanity. The Valkyrie itself seemed to groan, not with the familiar creaks of a working vessel, but with something akin to a living agony. These incidents always seemed to follow Elias's nightly concerts. The music, once a comfort, now felt like an insidious presence, seeping into the very timbers, whispering through the ventilation shafts. The beautiful notes, once so captivating, now carried an undertone of something predatory, a silent, unseen hook slowly embedding itself into the ship's soul. The crew, once fascinated, now avoided Elias's gaze, a cold dread replacing their initial wonder. They were far from home, and the sea, once their familiar domain, felt increasingly alien, its depths hiding not just fish, but something that had come aboard with the quiet fiddler. The Valkyrie was no longer just a ship. It was a stage for a slow, psychological horror. The mystery of what Elias truly was, and what his haunting music sought to accomplish, had only just begun to unravel. To continue this chilling investigation with me, to delve deeper into the unexplainable, ensure you hit that like button and subscribe to the Maritime Chronicler. Join our growing crew of anomaly investigators as we navigate the darkest currents of the unknown. Elias. The name itself felt too simple, too common for the man who bore it. No one on the Valkyrie truly knew where he came from. He had materialized at the last moment, a shadow slipping aboard amidst the chaos of provisions and last-minute checks. His papers, when Captain Erickson had finally pressed for them, were sparse, almost skeletal. A name, a birth date, no next of kin, no previous maritime experience listed beyond a vague, untraceable general labor. It was a blank slate, a ghost's ledger. Erickson, desperate to meet the sailing schedule after the previous crewman's sudden departure, had reluctantly accepted, his intuition prickling with an unease he couldn't articulate. The crew tried at first to learn more about him. "Where are you from, Elias?" Young Lars, ever curious, had asked one quiet afternoon. Elias had merely smiled, a slow, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "From where the water meets the sky," he'd murmured, his voice as smooth and deep as the ocean itself, "and where the old songs are still sung." It was a poetic evasion, one that Lars, in his youthful romanticism, had initially found charming. Later, he would remember it as the first thread of ice. His violin, however, spoke volumes. It was an old instrument, its dark wood gleaming with the patina of countless hours of play. But Elias handled it with an unsettling intimacy, almost as if it were an extension of his own flesh. He never tuned it, never cleaned it, yet the notes that emanated from it were always flawless, pure, and hauntingly precise. The sounds were a paradox, ethereal and beautiful, yet carrying a palpable weight, a sense of immense ancient power. It was the kind of music that settled in the marrow of your bones, that hummed in the spaces between thoughts. Old Man Bjorn, the ship's most experienced deckhand, a man who had seen more than his share of strange occurrences at sea, was the first to articulate the growing dread. "His music, it's not played," Bjorn had rasped one evening, watching Elias from a distance. "It is," he paused, rubbing a gnarled hand over his beard. "It feels like it's always been there, just waiting for him to pull it out of the air." This observation, dismissed by some as the ramblings of an old salt, began to resonate with the others. The melodies were too perfect, too resonant for a simple human performance. They seemed to carry the very essence of the sea, the mournful sigh of the wind, the crashing fury of a storm, the deep, silent pressure of the abyss. And as the days bled into weeks, the music's influence deepened. The salt spray on deck tasted sharper. The creak of the hull sounded more pronounced. The darkness of the North Sea nights felt heavier, more alive. It was as if Elias's music wasn't just music. It was a conduit, a bridge between their mundane, steel and diesel world and something ancient, something that pulsed beneath the waves. The crew started to notice that after Elias finished playing, a strange stillness would descend upon the ship, a vacuum where the usual hum of machinery seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of their own uneasy breathing. It was in these moments of profound quiet that the subtle anomalies, the accidents, and the malfunctions would often occur like ripples in a pond after a stone has been dropped. The Valkyrie was being woven into a different kind of tapestry, one spun from haunting melodies and unsettling silences. Elias, the silent fiddler, was the weaver, and his instrument the loom, and the crew, adrift on the vast, indifferent ocean, were the threads. The subtle anomalies, once dismissed as mere coincidences, began to escalate with chilling predictability. They were no longer isolated incidents, but formed a pattern, a slow, tightening noose around the crew's collective sanity. Each night after Elias's violin had sung its haunting lullaby across the waves, the ship would descend into a realm of waking nightmares. Crew members, usually hardened by the sea's brutal realities, began to report vivid, disturbing dreams. These weren't the common anxieties of a sailor's life, they were visceral, shared nightmares. Men would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, whispering fragmented images, icy water closing over their heads, the sound of strange, mournful singing from below the hull, or the sight of familiar faces twisting into grotesque, watery visages. Old Bjorn, who typically snored through gales, awoke one morning recounting a dream where the Valkyrie was not a ship at all, but a monstrous, skeletal hand reaching up from the depths, its fingers tipped with rusted hooks, and at its heart, a single, impossibly bright, unblinking eye. The physical environment of the ship itself seemed to warp under the music's influence. Tools, meticulously stored, would vanish from their racks, only to reappear hours later in impossible places. A wrench tucked into a coiled rope in the crow's nest, a fishing knife embedded in the captain's logbook, or a hammer found floating, impossibly, in a bucket of fresh water. No one could explain it. Fingers were pointed, accusations whispered, but the underlying truth was far more unsettling. There was no human agent. It was as if the ship itself had become sentient, mischievous, or perhaps malevolent. The Valkyrie's internal noises, once comforting, became a source of profound unease. The creak of the bulkheads, the groan of the rigging, the rhythmic thrum of the engine, all began to take on an unsettlingly human quality. The ship groaned like a living thing in pain, its timbers crying out with a sound that was too close to a human wail. The wind, whistling through the vents, mimicked sighs and whispers. Even the distant clang of the engine room seemed to pulse with an unnatural heartbeat. One afternoon, young Lars, pale and trembling, approached the captain. "The ropes, sir," he stammered, his eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the cold. They moved on their own, like snakes. I was coiling the trawl lines, and a section just writhed, like it was alive. Eriksson, a man of logic and steel, had scoffed, attributing it to fatigue and the punishing North Sea weather. But later, alone in his cabin, he found himself staring at the compass, now spinning lazily, ceaselessly, regardless of the ship's actual heading. He ran a hand over the cold brass and swore he felt a faint, rhythmic vibration beneath his palm, too slow to be the engine, too deep to be the waves. It felt like a pulse. The crew, once a cohesive unit, began to splinter. Suspicion festered. Each man eyed his bunkmate, wondering if the other was succumbing to the strange influence, or worse, somehow complicit. Elias, meanwhile, remained an island of unsettling calm, his dark eyes observing, his violin always within reach, its silent presence a constant, chilling reminder of the source of their escalating nightmare. The music, they realized, was not just for their ears. It was for the Valkyrie itself, a spell being cast upon its very structure, transforming their sanctuary into a living, groaning prison, slowly, inexorably, pulling them into the depths of a horror they could not comprehend. The insidious influence of Elias's music deepened, twisting the very fabric of the crew's minds. What began as disturbing dreams and inexplicable mishaps now manifested as profound psychological shifts, eroding their resilience and isolating them in a shared, silent madness. The melodies, once passively absorbed, now actively permeated their thoughts, becoming an inescapable internal soundtrack. Sailors grew withdrawn, their usual boisterous conversations replaced by long, vacant silences. Their eyes, once sharp with the sea's keen observation, now held a distant, hazy quality, as if focused on something far beyond the visible horizon. Some, unable to escape the haunting refrains, began to hum Elias's tunes under their breath, a quiet, unnerving drone that echoed through the mess hall, the engine room, even the cramped sleeping quarters. It was a wordless, collective incantation, binding them ever tighter to the unseen force aboard. The most alarming transformation struck the ship's cook, a gruff, portly man named Ole, known for his unshakable stoicism and his legendary ability to whip up a hearty meal in the roughest seas. Ole was the pragmatic heart of the Valkyrie, grounding the crew with his no-nonsense attitude and the comforting aroma of his cooking. But one frigid morning, Captain Eriksson found him in the wheelhouse, his face pale and contorted, a heavy wrench clutched in his hand. Ole wasn't cooking. He was systematically attempting to dismantle the ship's compass. Its delicate mechanisms, usually guarded with meticulous care, were exposed, gears scattered like spilled coins across the charts. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his eyes, usually twinkling with good humor, were unfocused, glazed over with a strange, fervent intensity. "Ole, what in the name of the deep are you doing?" Eriksson roared, grabbing the wrench from his hand. Ole flinched, as if startled awake. Then his gaze returned to the scattered compass parts, a look of profound distress washing over his face. "The song, Captain," he mumbled, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "The song needs direction. It's lost. It needs to find its way home." He pointed a trembling finger at the exposed gears. "It's all wrong. The song can't find its path with this broken heart." Eriksson, a man who believed only in charts and stars, felt a cold dread snake through his gut. Ole, the most grounded man on the ship, was speaking in riddles, his mind clearly unmoored. There was no logical explanation, no sudden fever or head injury, just the profound, disturbing shift in his mental state, directly linked to the pervasive, hypnotic melodies. Attempts to reason with Ole were futile. He could only repeat variations of "the song needs direction," his voice growing increasingly agitated. The incident sent a jolt of raw fear through the remaining crew. If Ole, the unshakable, could be so easily broken, what hope was there for them? The lines of communication, once robust, dissolved into wary silence. Each man suspected the other, not of malice, but of succumbing to the same unseen influence that had claimed Ol. The air on the Valkyrie grew thick with unspoken paranoia, a suffocating fog that made every creak of the ship, every distant hum from the engine sound like a conspiratorial whisper. Elias, of course, was never far from these scenes. He watched with a quiet intensity, his violin resting in its case like a dormant predator, and every night the music would flow, weaving its invisible threads deeper into the minds of the men, guiding them inexorably towards a destination only Elias and his haunting melody seemed to know. The Valkyrie was no longer simply sailing, it was being led. Captain Magnus Eriksson was a man of the sea, his life meticulously charted by sextants, compasses, and the ironclad rules of maritime navigation. His private log, a leather-bound book kept under lock and key in his cabin, was usually a terse factual record of course corrections, weather patterns, and cargo manifests. But as the Valkyrie drifted deeper into the North Sea and deeper into its own unfolding nightmare, Eriksson's entries began to betray a profound, unshakable dread, a chilling departure from his usual disciplined prose. Log entry, October 14th. Weather holding but unusual calm. Sea unnaturally still. Elias played again tonight. The crew seems altered, distant. Ol found in wheelhouse, attempting to dismantle compass. Claims the song needs direction. Ordered him confined to quarters. Fear this is more than simple madness. The music, it feels like a physical presence now, like a cold hand on the back of my neck. Eriksson, a man who scoffed at superstition, found himself scrutinizing Elias with a growing, desperate intensity. He studied the fiddler's face during his nightly performances, the unblinking gaze that seemed to pierce through the cabin walls, focusing on something unseen beyond the horizon. There was an unfathomable sorrow in Elias's playing, a deep, ancient grief that seemed to resonate with the very core of the ocean. It was a sorrow so profound it felt alien, too vast for any human heart. Yet, it was this same sorrow that seemed to draw the crew in, binding them with an invisible, unbreakable thread. Log entry, October 17th. The men are losing themselves. Young Lars speaks of whispers from the deep in his sleep. Gunnar, the old cynic, keeps muttering about eyes in the waves. Even my own sleep is troubled by discordant melodies. Elias plays on, oblivious or uncaring. His eyes, they reflect no light, only the endless dark of the water. The captain tried to impose order, to reassert the logical rhythms of the ship. He doubled watches, enforced stricter routines, even considered disabling Elias's violin. But the thought itself brought a strange, visceral revulsion, a premonition of disaster. It was as if the instrument and the music it produced had become too deeply intertwined with the Valkyrie itself. To silence it felt like tearing a vital organ from the ship's very soul. Log entry, October 20th. The ship groans constantly now, not the familiar sounds of working steel, but something organic, like a creature in pain or in pleasure. The crew's paranoia escalates. They avoid each other's eyes, suspecting a shared, unspoken madness. I find myself listening for the music even when it is not being played, a phantom echo in the cold air. Elias simply watches. His silence is more terrifying than any storm. I cannot explain this. My charts offer no answers. My experience offers no guidance. We are adrift in something far older than the sea. Eriksson knew the sea. He knew its tempers, its deceptions, its brutal indifference. But this was different. This was a calculated, deliberate unraveling. The enemy was not the storm, nor the ice, nor the crushing depths. The enemy was within, a quiet presence wielding an ancient melody, slowly, meticulously, driving his crew towards an unknown, terrible purpose. His final entry for that week was stark, a desperate plea etched onto the page. Log entry, October 21st. We are lost, not geographically, but fundamentally. Elias's music is not just music, it is a current, and we are all caught in its pull. The insidious current of Elias's music reached its terrifying zenith one frigid night, transforming the creeping dread into a harrowing, almost tragedy that left the remaining crew shaken to their core. Elias had taken to playing his violin on the main deck, his silhouette stark against the glow of the mast lights, the mournful notes carried on the biting North Sea wind. The crew, drawn by an invisible compulsion, had gathered silently, their faces vacant, their bodies swaying almost imperceptibly to the rhythm. Among them was young Eric, the youngest deckhand, barely 18, his face typically alight with youthful optimism. Tonight, however, his eyes held the same distant, unfocused gaze that now haunted the faces of many aboard. Elias's melody, particularly mournful and elongated, seemed to wrap around Eric, binding him, drawing him. Slowly, deliberately, Eric began to move towards the starboard rail. His steps were fluid, almost graceful, as if he were dancing to a silent partner only he could perceive. His arms began to rise, outstretched, not in a gesture of despair, but of profound yearning, as if reaching for an unseen embrace. The other sailors, lost in their own daze, barely registered his movement. He reached the rail, his fingers brushing the cold steel. The waves below, black and churning, seemed to beckon with a soft, hungry whisper. Elias's violin swelled, the notes becoming a shimmering, siren-like call, impossibly beautiful, impossibly compelling. Eric's legs swung over the rail. He was going to walk off the deck into the frigid, devouring sea. It was old Bjorn, surprisingly, who broke free of the trance first. Perhaps his years of battling the sea had forged a resilience that even Elias's music could not entirely shatter. A guttural cry tore from his throat. "Eric, no!" The sound, raw and desperate, seemed to momentarily crack the spell. Captain Erickson, who had been standing rigid at the edge of the crowd, snapped into action. He lunged forward, tackling Eric just as the young man was about to step into the abyss. They tumbled to the deck, the impact rattling the ship. Eric thrashed, not with the panic of a man saved from drowning, but with the bewildered rage of someone whose profound communion had been violently interrupted. His eyes, though now open, were still vacant, unseeing, fixed on some internal watery vision. He struggled against Erickson's grip, his body surprisingly strong, murmuring words that chilled them to the bone. The song needs me. I must join the song. The violin music, which had briefly faltered at Bjorn's cry, now resumed, a furious, discordant shriek that seemed to tear at the very air. Elias's head snapped up, his unblinking gaze fixing on Erickson and the struggling Eric. For the first time, a flicker of something other than serene detachment crossed his features, a flash of cold, ancient fury. The notes vibrated with a raw, primal power, no longer mournful, but demanding, commanding. The other crew members, jolted from their stupor by the struggle, looked on with a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. The beautiful music was a weapon. It was a lure, and it had almost claimed one of their own. The Valkyrie itself seemed to shudder, as if in sympathy with the furious music, its timbers groaning louder, its mast lights flickering wildly. The sea below them seemed to churn with unseen currents, mirroring the chaos above. Eric was eventually subdued, lashed to his bunk, still whispering about the song. The near tragedy had ripped away the last vestiges of doubt. Elias was not merely a strange fiddler. His music was not just a performance. It was an active, malevolent force, seeking to claim them, one by one, for the hungry depths. And the horror was not that they were being hunted, but that they were being lured, drawn willingly to their doom by a melody they could not resist. The true nature of their predicament had finally begun to reveal itself. The near loss of Eric shattered the last illusions of normalcy aboard the Valkyrie. The crew, though still under the music's pervasive influence, now carried a new, terrifying certainty. Elias was not one of them. He was something else, but it was Old Man Gunner, the ship's grizzled engineer, a man whose cynicism was as ingrained as the salt in his beard, who came closest to glimpsing the true, horrifying nature of their tormentor. Gunner had seen much in his decades at sea, storms that ripped ships apart, men driven mad by isolation, the silent, crushing indifference of the deep. He trusted only what he could see, touch, and measure. Elias, with his ethereal music and unsettling calm, had been a puzzle, an irritant, but not a threat he could quantify, until now. After the incident with Eric, Gunnar found himself unable to sleep. The phantom violin notes echoed in his mind, thin and sharp as ice shards. He rose, restless, and wandered the ship, his heavy boots echoing in the unnatural silence. He found Elias on the lower deck, near the stern, his back to Gunnar, gazing out at the ink-black water. The fiddler was not playing, but his presence radiated an almost palpable stillness, a profound cold that seemed to emanate from him. Gunnar paused, hidden in the shadows, observing. He watched Elias's unmoving form, then glanced around the dim, enclosed space. His eyes fell upon a highly polished brass porthole, its surface gleaming like a dark, distorted mirror. It was then, in that fleeting, peripheral glance, that the horror solidified. In the polished brass, Elias's reflection shimmered. But it was not his reflection. It was distorted, ancient, a face of water and shadow, its features impossibly elongated, its eyes vast, black pools that held no human light. Tendrils of what looked like seaweed or dark, flowing hair seemed to writhe around its head. The mouth, when it moved, was a silent, gaping maw, not quite human, a dark void in the watery visage. It was utterly, terrifyingly inhuman. Gunnar blinked, then looked directly at Elias. The fiddler stood as before, a man, silent and still. He looked back at the porthole. The reflection was gone, replaced by the normal, slightly distorted image of the ship's stern. Gunnar's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a cold, liquid dread seep into his very bones, colder than any North Sea gale. He had seen it, a glimpse behind the mask. Elias was not a man. He was something from the deep, something that could mimic a man, but whose true form was of water and shadow, an entity of ancient, predatory beauty. He stumbled back, a gasp catching in his throat. The sound, small as it was, seemed to echo in the profound stillness. Elias turned, slowly, his dark eyes meeting Gunnar's. There was no anger, no surprise, just a knowing, ancient patience. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Elias's lips, a smile that held no warmth, only the chilling promise of inevitable doom. Gunnar fled, scrambling back to the crew quarters, his mind reeling. He tried to warn the others, his voice a frantic, desperate rasp. "He's not real. Elias, he's a demon of the water. I saw his true face in the glass, like a drowning man, but not human." But the pervasive unease, the subtle, mind-numbing influence of the music had already done its work. The crew, already teetering on the brink of shared delusion, looked at Gunnar with pity, then with irritation. His agitated state, his wild eyes, his breathless, fragmented account of a water face. It all sounded like the ravings of a man finally succumbing to the pressure, like Ole. "Gunnar, calm yourself," Captain Erickson said, his voice weary, strained. "You're overtired. It's the sea playing tricks on your mind." They dismissed him as senile, another casualty of the voyage's mounting psychological toll. They couldn't, or wouldn't, see what Gunnar had seen. Elias, the silent fiddler, remained among them, his disguise undisturbed, his terrifying secret now confirmed by one and dismissed by all others. The enemy was not just among them, it was their trusted companion, leading them, with the haunting beauty of its music, towards a fate none of them yet fully understood. And Gunnar, the man who had seen the truth, was now isolated, his desperate warnings fading into the ship's pervasive, unsettling hum. The Valkyrie had become a stage for a final, terrifying performance. Elias's music, once a subtle lure, now swelled into a full, symphonic assault, a terrifying crescendo designed to draw the remaining crew into the depths. It was no longer merely a melody. It was a force, a palpable presence that filled every inch of the ship, thrumming in the very air. The notes were a horrifying tapestry, the mournful dirges of ancient drownings, the siren calls of unseen currents, the joyful, predatory song of the abyss. It vibrated through the deck, through the bulkheads, through the very bones of the men. It was a symphony of oblivion, each note a whispered promise of release, of peace in the cold embrace of the deep. The remaining crew members, their faces pale and drawn, swayed uncontrollably, their eyes glazed over, their bodies straining towards the rail, towards the beckoning darkness of the ocean. The Valkyrie itself seemed to respond to this unseen current. The ship, once a sturdy vessel, now listed heavily to port, not from a rogue wave or shifting cargo, but as if willingly tilting towards the water, responding to the unseen conductor. The timbers groaned in unison with the music, a low, resonant hum that merged with Elias's playing. The mast lights flickered wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like watery specters. The ship was no longer merely carrying them, it was becoming an extension of the music, a willing participant in their impending doom. Captain Eriksson, his face a mask of grim determination, fought against the hypnotic pull with every fiber of his being. Gunnar's frantic warnings, dismissed just hours before, now echoed with chilling clarity in his mind. The distorted reflection, the water face. It clicked into place with a horrifying, undeniable logic. Elias was not human. His music was not art. It was a weapon, an ancient, malevolent force that had come aboard their ship. He looked at his crew, their faces slack with a terrifying ecstasy, their bodies already leaning, yearning for the cold embrace. He saw young Eric, still tied to his bunk, but now straining against his bonds, his eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the hull, humming Elias's tune with a chilling devotion. Eriksson knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that if the music continued, they would all be lost. They would walk into the sea, willingly, joyfully, drawn by the siren song of the Nøkken. There was only one way to break the spell. With a guttural roar, Eriksson moved. He didn't speak, for words were useless against such a force. He lunged across the deck, his eyes fixed on Elias, who stood, a dark, serene figure, his bow sawing through the air, drawing forth the symphony of doom. Elias's head remained tilted, his eyes closed in an almost blissful absorption, his music soaring to an impossible crescendo. Eriksson reached him, not with a weapon, but with the raw, desperate strength of a man fighting for his soul and the souls of his crew. He grabbed the violin, not by the neck, but by its body, twisting, pulling, aiming to silence the instrument that had become their tormentor. Elias's eyes snapped open, blazing with an ancient, furious light that seemed to burn with the cold fire of the abyssal depths. A silent scream ripped through the air, not from Elias's throat, but from the very fabric of the ship, a sound of profound violation. With a desperate final heave, Eriksson brought the violin down against the steel railing with all his might. The sound was not the sharp crack of wood, but a sickening, wet crunch, like bone against rock. The beautiful, haunting melody shrieked, then dissolved into a guttural, dying wail. The music shattered, and with it, the spell. The shattering of the violin was not an end, but a catalyst. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a deafening, raw vacuum, instantly filled by the terrified gasps and disoriented cries of the crew as they snapped out of their trance. The ship, no longer guided by Elias's will, lurched violently, its unnatural list correcting itself with a groan of stressed metal. The mast lights, freed from the music's dominion, steadied, casting a stark, unforgiving light on the chaos. The spell was broken, but the nightmare was far from over. Elias, now stripped of his instrument, was transformed. The serene, almost ethereal calm that had always cloaked him dissolved, revealing something ancient, furious, and utterly monstrous. His eyes, no longer merely dark, blazed with an icy, predatory light, reflecting the raw, untamed power of the abyss. His form seemed to shimmer, his silhouette wavering at the edges, hinting at the watery, inhuman shape Gunnar had glimpsed. The Valkyrie itself became a battlefield of mind and matter. The ship, having been so deeply attuned to Elias's song, now reacted with violent spasms. Pipes burst, spraying scalding water across the deck. Generators sputtered, plunging sections of the ship into sudden darkness. The very air grew heavy, thick with the smell of salt, and something else, ozone perhaps, or the cold, metallic scent of impending doom. The crew, jolted awake from their hypnotic stupor, were now confronted by the physical manifestation of their terror. Elias moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, no longer the quiet fiddler, but a force of nature. He didn't fight with fists or weapons. He fought with the subtle manipulation of their environment. the ship itself. Doors slammed shut, trapping men in cramped compartments. Ladders became slick with an inexplicable icy film. Loose lines whipped through the air like venomous snakes. Captain Erickson, clutching the splintered remains of the violin, found himself locked in a silent, desperate struggle with Elias. The creature, no longer bothering with human speech, emitted a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the deck. It lunged, not to strike, but to envelop, its hands reaching for Erickson not with malice, but with a horrifying, possessive intent, as if to reclaim the shattered instrument, or perhaps to drag him into its true element. The battle was chaotic, nightmarish. Men screamed, not from physical injury, but from the sheer, overwhelming terror of witnessing reality bend. Old Bjorn, wielding a gaff hook, swung at the wavering form of Elias, the metal passing through him as if he were made of mist, only to strike against a sudden, inexplicably solid bulkhead. Lars, still trembling from his near drowning, found himself surrounded by coils of rope that seemed to tighten around him, whispering the broken melody in his ears. The ship groaned and screamed around them, a symphony of metal and fear. The line between reality and hallucination blurred. Were the shadows dancing on the bulkheads truly Elias's shifting form, or were they the products of their own unraveling minds? Was the cold, wet touch on their skin truly the spray of the sea, or the touch of something ancient and frigid? Amidst the chaos, a desperate, primal instinct for survival reasserted itself. The crew, though terrified, began to fight back, not against Elias directly, for he was intangible, but against the ship's attempts to consume them. They fought against the tightening ropes, the slamming doors, the inexplicable currents that sought to drag them overboard. Each man, in his own way, battled the pervasive, insidious influence that had seeped into the Valkyrie. The struggle was not a conventional one. It was a fight against an unseen enemy that could manipulate their perceptions, their environment, and their very sanity. Elias, the Nøkken, was not merely a monster. He was a living nightmare, and the Valkyrie was his hunting ground, vibrating with his silent, furious song. The only question that remained was who would be pulled into the depths first, and who, if anyone, would escape the impossible horror that now stalked their ship. When the Norwegian Coast Guard finally located the Valkyrie 3 days later, it was a ghost ship. Adrift, battered, and silent, it bobbed aimlessly on the vast, indifferent expanse of the North Sea. Its mast lights, though still burning, cast a weak, flickering glow over a deck littered with discarded gear and the silent, terrifying evidence of a struggle no one could comprehend. The rescue teams, hardened by years of responding to maritime disasters, were met not with the expected cries of relief, but with a profound, unsettling quiet. Most of the crew were found huddled in the ship's mess, their faces etched with an unshakable terror. Some were catatonic, their eyes wide and unseeing, their lips moving silently, endlessly humming a haunting, wordless melody that seemed to seep into the very air of the ship. Others wept uncontrollably, unable to articulate the horrors they had witnessed. A few, like Captain Erickson and Old Bjorn, were conscious, but their accounts were disjointed, filled with wild, unbelievable claims of a singing demon and a ship that came alive. Elias, the enigmatic fiddler, was gone, vanished without a trace. His shattered violin was found near the stern, its dark wood splintered, its strings snapped, a mute testament to the desperate, climactic struggle that had occurred. There was no body, no blood, no sign of how he had departed the ship. It was as if he had simply dissolved back into the water from which he had seemingly emerged. The Valkyrie was towed back to port, a broken, haunted vessel. The survivors were taken to hospitals, then to psychiatric wards. Doctors and psychologists struggled to piece together their accounts, attributing the shared delusions to mass hysteria, exacerbated by extreme isolation, fatigue, and the psychological pressures of a prolonged voyage. They spoke of the power of suggestion, of group psychosis, and of the sea's inherent ability to play tricks on the human mind. The official report cited unforeseen mechanical failures and severe psychological distress among the crew as the cause of the vessel's adrift status. The strange incidents, the vanishing tools, the groaning ship, all dismissed as products of an unraveling collective mind. But for those who had been aboard the Valkyrie, the truth was far more chilling. The melody, they said, still whispered on the wind for those who listened too closely. Some of the survivors, even years later, would occasionally slip back into that catatonic state, their eyes glazing over, their lips beginning the slow, soft hum of Elias's tune. It was a melody that, once heard, could never truly be forgotten, its tendrils reaching from the depths, forever seeking to reclaim what it had almost possessed, the Nøkken, the shape-shifting water spirit of Norwegian folklore, known for luring victims to their watery graves with impossibly beautiful music. The legend spoke of a creature that could take any form, but always, its essence was tied to the water, and its lure, the haunting song of a violin, or a fiddle, or a harp. It was a creature that fed not on flesh, but on despair, on the willing surrender of souls drawn by the promise of ultimate peace in the cold, dark depths. Was Elias truly gone, or merely returned to the cold, dark depths, his form dissolving into the currents, waiting for the next ship, the next soul, to fall under the spell of his haunting, beautiful music? The Valkyrie had survived, but it carried the scars of an impossible encounter, a silent testament to the thin veil between the mundane and the monstrous. And somewhere, out in the vast, indifferent expanse of the North Sea, the melody, they say, still whispers on the wind for those who listen too closely. And for those who are drawn to its impossible beauty, the sea holds secrets far more terrifying than any storm. The Valkyrie returned, but not whole. Its hull bore no gaping wounds, no catastrophic failures. Its damage was etched into the very souls of its crew, a silent testament to a horror that defied every chart and every navigational law. The official reports speak of mass hysteria, of psychological breakdown induced by isolation and the relentless North Sea. They suggest a shared delusion, a collective madness born of fear and fatigue, painting Elias as a catalyst for a human unraveling, rather than its monstrous cause. Perhaps a rogue wave, unseen and unrecorded, battered the ship, causing the initial accidents, and the crew, already strained, simply broke under the pressure, projecting their terror onto the quiet fiddler. But what of the unblinking gaze, the impossible sorrow in his music? What of Gunnar's fleeting glimpse of a face woven from water and shadow? What of the ship itself, groaning in sympathy, listing towards the depths, as if drawn by an unseen current? The logical mind demands a rational explanation. The sea, however, has always held secrets that logic cannot penetrate. For centuries, Norwegian sailors have whispered of the Nøkken, a shape-shifting water spirit dwelling in the darkest fjords and the deepest seas. Not a giant beast, but a cunning entity, capable of mimicking human form, but always tied to the water. Its lure? Music, an impossibly beautiful melody played on a violin, a fiddle, or a harp, designed to draw the unwary, the desperate, the lonely, into the cold, embracing depths. The Nøkken feeds not on flesh, but on the despair of souls it claims, on the willing surrender to oblivion. Was Elias merely a man, a victim of circumstance, or was he something far older, far more ancient than the Valkyrie itself? Was he a manifestation of the Nøkken, a creature of the deep who found the perfect stage in a lonely trawler and its isolated crew? He vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the splintered wood of his violin and the indelible, haunting melody that still whispers in the minds of those who survived. The Valkyrie sails no more, its ghost rumored to drift through the fjords, but the questions remain, echoing across the vast, indifferent ocean. Was it madness, or was it something truly from the profound, terrifying depths? What do you believe happened aboard the Valkyrie? Have you heard of similar legends of the Nøkken or other water spirits that lure with music? Share your thoughts and your own encounters with the unexplained in the comments below. Your insights deepen our investigation into the maritime mysteries that haunt our world.